Well, social activism is crucial to, I think, moving society forward. So we face a lot of global challenges right now, and one of the ways that we break out of and solve and create solutions to those global challenges is through activism. So, yeah, actually I just basically got off the plane yesterday and I'm leaving tonight on like a 25-hour flight. So I am really excited to be here. My name is Micah White. I am one of the co-creators of Occupy Wall Street. And the reason I came to this conference to meet you guys, to talk to you, is because I started as a high school activist. My earliest activism was in high school, and I want to really impress upon you the importance of continuing to pursue critical thinking and activism, because you can one day create a social movement that will change the world. I want to thank Sakina and Sarah and all the other organizers from the Bali Island School for bringing me here to this conference. It's been so far really amazing. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to basically give you a lot of information about how to create a social movement, and then I'm going to give you an opportunity to ask me any questions that you want. So as I'm talking, if you think of a question that you want to ask, just make a note of it, and we're going to line up by these microphones behind you, and you're going to have a chance to ask me, and everyone can listen, and I will reply. I'm going to break my talk into 3 parts. Okay, the first part is a history of Occupy Wall Street, how we created Occupy Wall Street. The second part is a theory, of activism and how you create social change. And then the third part is kind of practical advice. What can you really use now to create social change? So now let me just give you a little bit of history of Occupy Wall Street. What was it? How did we create it? On the picture here, you'll see a scene from Occupy Wall Street. This is actually in Berlin, and it shows you how large our events were, and also that they spread around the world. Okay, so let's go back to 2011. In February of 2011, a social movement started in the Arab world. It was called the Arab Spring. And it began in Tunisia when a fruit seller, a poor fruit seller, had his fruit cart confiscated by the police. And he went down to the governor's office to protest, and he said, "Give me back my fruit cart." And the governor ignored, wouldn't even see him. So he went into the street and he set himself on fire. And he started shouting, "How do you want me to live?" Basically, he was so desperate for justice that he killed himself publicly. And that unleashed a tremendous rage and passion among the people in Tunisia and abroad. And soon other people started setting themselves on fire. And it was this insane kind of eruption of emotion. And then they, in Tunisia, toppled their dictator, and the movement spread to Egypt, where it suddenly inspired large numbers of people to gather in Tahrir Square. And they started to demand that Mubarak, who had been in power for like 20 plus years, that he step down. Okay, so the first element was this social movement that arose in the Arab world called the Arab Spring, and the tactic of taking a public space and refusing to leave until your demand was met. That was in February. And what happened is Mubarak actually was kicked out. So it worked. And as soon as it worked, it inspired more people around the world. Next, it went to Spain. The people of Spain got inspired, and they started to go into their squares. But what they did that was different is they started to hold general assemblies where they would use consensus-based decision-making, and they would start to discuss complex issues. How do we resolve these complex issues together? And they tried to create new forms of democracy. That was called the 15 May movement, and it spread all over Spain. So what we did, at the time I was working for a Canadian magazine, what we did is we saw that there's this potential revolutionary moment building all over the world. And we took the model of Tahrir, of Egypt, and we combined it with Spain, and we said to people, hey, let's go down to Wall Street, which is the financial headquarters of America and also sort of the world where the stock market is. Let's go down to Wall Street, let's stay there permanently until our demand is met, and let's hold a general assembly and come up with our demand, which we suggested should be to get money out of politics. Okay? Because in America, maybe you don't realize this, but in America, the High Court recently ruled that corporations can give unlimited money to candidates. So whoever has the most money usually wins the election. So the key thing to realize, the first point, is that social movements are created by a contagious mood, a mood of fearlessness, and a new tactic. You combine a new mood with a new tactic, and suddenly people rush to join and they follow, and the movement grows substantially out of control. And what you'll see here on these pictures is the movement spreading to Germany. And Occupy Wall Street ended up spreading to 82 countries in 1,000 different encampments all over the world. Okay, so that's a little bit of a history of how we created Occupy Wall Street, okay? But now a kind of the theory. So what happened, though? What happened with Occupy Wall Street? The movement grew substantially very quickly, but in the end, the movement was defeated. I call Occupy Wall Street a constructive failure because it taught us something about the nature of activism. We learned that it's not enough to just do disruptive behaviors. We believed that that by having these general assemblies, that somehow we would gain political sovereignty, that they wouldn't be able to evict us, that we would be able to change the course of our governments. And we learned instead that that's not true. So what we need is a deeper and more comprehensive understanding of the nature of social change. And what I want to present to you is kind of a way of thinking about activism that I think will help you create social movements. Okay, so imagine a grid, okay, and there's one side, one spectrum from left to right is subjective, and the other side is objective. So this means on the one side that forces are subjective, which is inside of human control, human mind, or objective, outside of human control, outside of the human mind. And then from the top to the bottom is natural and supernatural. So on the bottom is movement, or that ideas that movements are a natural phenomenon, and on the top involve the natural world. Okay, so if you make a grid out of these points, it creates 4 different options that I think help people understand about activism. In the lower left-hand corner, which is the idea that activism is a subjective process involving humans and a natural phenomenon involving the material world, we get the dominant notion of activism, which is voluntarism. This is the idea that we have to create actions. Human actions are what create change. So in order to create change, you need large numbers of people doing synchronized behaviors like marching or occupying. This is perfectly exemplified by this photo, right? We were able to convince these thousands and thousands of people to go into the streets on a certain day with signs and start to make demands because we believed that that would create social change. So that's called voluntarism. But there's another option. If you go onto the other lower right-hand side of the grid, what if revolution is actually a natural phenomenon, but it doesn't involve humans? So think about this. There's been studies that have shown that revolutions actually happen when food prices increase. Okay, so if food prices reach a certain level, then revolutions are more likely to occur. So they're not a process that involves human agency. It's not necessary to get large numbers of people into the streets in order to create social change. Instead, you would just have to wait until food prices increase or there's an economic or political crisis. So that's a second way of thinking about it. So that's the kind of theoretical basis that I want you to think about, is how to think about activism from those 4 perspectives. It's not about, I think it's really important not to just pick one of the 4, but instead to think about movements from all of the 4 perspectives. So the idea would be voluntarism, how to get people to do synchronized behaviors. Structuralism, how to learn what kind of economic situation is beneficial for dramatic social change. Subjectivism, which is the idea that how are we going to get people to suddenly change their ideas en masse. And then the 4th one, theurgy, how are we going to use some sort of divine intervention, or how do we use that more spiritual power? Now I just want to do a little bit of practical advice, and there's going to be, I think it's really important that we have a discussion, so there's going to be some time for questions, like I said. So practical advice. This conference, I think, is really important precisely because if you look at the tagline back here, it takes innovation, action, and collaboration to solve a problem both global and local. I think that is so key. So let's look at each of those 3 terms. The first one is innovation. Innovation for activism means to never protest the same way twice. This is, I think, one of the most important and difficult things for activists to accept. Once you develop a new protest tactic, you actually have to abandon it very quickly because your opponents, they learn almost immediately, right? So with Occupy Wall Street, we got millions of people in 82 countries to go into their financial districts, to set up encampments, to sleep overnight, to protest, to demand. But once the authorities in those countries learned how to deal with that, at first they didn't know because they'd never seen it before, but once they learned how to deal with that, and they learned very quickly, within 2 months they learned, you'll notice that within 2 months, when they figured out how to deal with it, all of the encampments over the entire world were evicted in like the same week. Okay? So there's a fascinating thing here, which is you develop a new tactic, but if you don't innovate once you've developed that new tactic, then you're bound to lose. So, with Occupy Wall Street, once occupying stopped working, then the Occupy movement stopped working. So you have to think about that. How am I both going to develop a new tactic but then innovate? So innovation. Okay, second core thing that you're learning at this conference I think is really important is collaboration. Now, collaboration in the context of activism, it means that when you create a local protest movement, and I know there's a really important one happening in Bali right now, this Tolak Reklamasi, okay, the reclamation movement is really important happening right now. When you create a local protest movement, you have to remember that you're actually collaborating with a global movement. That our local protests are merely manifestations of a global people's struggle. And this is another reason why Occupy Wall Street was so powerful, okay? Because even though it started in Wall Street, it spread to every country because it was able to link up with people everywhere, and they saw that their individual struggle for democracy, whether it's in Berlin or in Australia, was the same struggle. So when you create a social movement, you orient it around a local issue, but you tie it into a global perspective. That's what collaboration means for activism. Okay, now the third key term here is action. Now, it's really important though to realize that time must be ripe. Okay, so when we think of action, we normally think like, how are we going to get people into the streets? Like, if only people would rush into the streets, then we would have a movement that would succeed. But instead, I think that you have to look at it the opposite way, which is how do we know when it's the right moment to go into the streets? How do we prepare people to be ready for that right moment so that we can really create a social movement instead of just creating kind of the endless spectacle of protests that don't seem to lead anywhere? And that, I think, is really hard for young people to accept, which is this idea that I need to be patient, that you need to wait, that there needs to be a crisis, an economic or political crisis, and that's the moment to call for your protests. So the third thing is action, this idea of knowing when it's the right moment to protest and how to call for the protest and be ready for the protest at that time. Core kind of ideas that I wanted to bring to you about how to create a social movement. Just to like kind of bring it to you again really quickly, okay? You start by combining a contagious mood with a new tactic. And you have to constantly innovate that tactic, change that tactic, and you have to link your movement to a global kind of storyline. And you also have to know when the time is right. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that was some food for thought. And then now I think what would be awesome is if we have some questions and answer, and then we kind of open it up into a more free-flow discussion.
Hello, I'm Faisal. I'm from the Singapore American School. And my question relates to the idea of activism and social movement. You speak a lot about protesting, but how does one distinguish between positive social movements and negative social movements? Possibly, do you believe that all mass-inspired, contagious ideas are positive for society?
Wow, that is a really good question. This is amazing to like actually come to a conference of high schoolers and then like get a very serious question that's very smart. I thank you so much. That is a very, very important question. Okay, so the important thing to realize is that social protest is it's like a weapon. It's a weapon of social change. And obviously not all social change is a positive force. And you actually see right now that different forces on the political spectrum want to kind of master the process of social movement creation. So right now in Germany, for example, they have anti-immigrant movements that are using techniques of social movement creation to kind of mobilize people against immigrants, which is, I would say, a negative goal, a xenophobic goal, and not a positive goal. And then at the same time, you have like, political extremism, religious extremism using Twitter and this kind of stuff. So to answer your question, it's almost like, when you create new ways of doing protests, you're developing a tool that almost anyone can use. And I agree with you that it's very important not just to think, oh, every time people go into the streets, it's like necessarily by itself a good thing. But at the same time, one of the ways I think you can tell a good movement from a bad movement is the idea that the people themselves should be in control of it. I think in the past what we've seen is that negative movements primarily are oriented around leaders who kind of use the people for their own means. But it is something to research. I think you have to really look at the Arab Spring and see how that played out, and to see how street protests were used to topple Morsi in order to get another dictator to power and this kind of thing. So it's a very sophisticated question, and I thank you very much. And I think it is very important to kind of have a critical mindset for these social protests.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bali school, and I wanted to ask, how do you deal with social movements? How do you deal with the negative and the positive responses from media?
You have to analyze how media works in your own personal country, but I'll give you I think 2 different ways that media can work. Okay, so in kind of let's say like more repressive places, like for example, if you look at the social movements that started in 2013 in Brazil, okay, at first the media was very negative. Okay, so one thing the media can do is they can be extremely negative. They can be talking about how these protests, they're so dirty, or they're detrimental, or they're not a positive force within society. They can kind of control the movement through telling the mass readership that this is a negative force. And that's, I think, hard to deal with, of course. But I think that that's actually less of a danger than what we have in America, which is that they kind of, at first, they celebrate the movement. And they start to flatter the movement. And they like to tell you the movement that you're doing so great, and this is so beautiful, and protest is so wonderful. And then they slowly chip away at your base, and they start to turn against you over time. And so I think that the key thing to realize is that instead of seeing ourselves reflected through the media, we have to develop our own media, which is something that Occupy did very well, I think, in the early stages. Instead of seeing ourselves through someone else's mirror, it's very important that we're projecting our message in our mirror. But you know what it is? It's again, social movement. It's not when you're basically what we're talking about is how do you vie for power? And as soon as you start to seriously vie for power, then all of the different forces within society that also want to vie for power, rich people, all kinds of people, they start to get in on the game. So it's very complex. And the main thing I think is to develop one's own media and to be kind of skeptical both of the flattery of the media and the critique of the media. Both are kind of used to control movements.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Anu. I'm also from Singapore American School.
Wow, we need some other schools to get up here, you guys. Come on. The Singapore American School's killing it. Okay.
So I want to take a look at this idea of activism from the opposite end on how do you maybe destroy a movement that has gotten powerful or perhaps too powerful.
Okay.
One that, especially a powerful force where they're all doing synchronized movements and they're at the prime of their movement. How do you shut down not just them in the sense that you're going to evict them off of Wall Street, but also shut down their ideology, because the ideology may be fundamentally poisonous.
Wow.
Okay, you want to play the other side. How do we shut down the social movement? Okay, so, why don't we learn from the example of how movements have been shut down? I think that on the one hand, there's a few common techniques that are used. Number one, infiltration. Okay, so even if you go back to the Russian Revolution, Lenin's secretary was a police spy. So here's someone who's at the top echelons. And then at one point, I think out of 7 Bolshevik leaders prior to the Russian Revolution, 3 of them were spies for the government. Okay, so you infiltrate, you get people into positions of power within the movement who are able to, they sabotage the movement by calling for extreme actions that alienate the public. That's one thing that you do. So you kind of distort the meaning of the movement from within. I think the second thing that you do is that you start to identify and target the leadership who are charismatic, and then you discredit them. Like in America, we have this thing called COINTELPRO, where they would use, they would spread lies about the leaders in order to like discredit them with the public. And then the third thing you do is you kind of develop a countermeasure against the specific tactics of that movement. With Occupy Wall Street, in order to evict people from the squares more easily, what they did is they first they would say, okay, we're going to evict everyone in 24 hours, and then everyone would show up to try to defend the space, but then they would wait, and they would wait 48 hours until everyone got tired, and then they would evict. It was that easy. You just kind of like, the protesters fell for it every time, So I think on the one hand, you infiltrate, the next thing you discredit, and the third is you develop countermeasures against the tactics being used. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lena from Beijing International Bilingual Academy. And believe it or not, I don't actually expect you to have a definite answer for this question. Like, I've had a hard time coming up with an answer, and it'd just be really amazing if I could give any like some comments or ideas around this, like maybe some possible solutions. But there are governments, such as the government in China, that have cracked down on social media, and I've realized as you've been speaking about how movements, successful movements such as Occupy Wall Street have taken place, they have built up through social media and through the internet, whereas in China it's very hard for people to get around that. There's also this issue with governments, such as, if you can call it a government, the Assad regime, where people are afraid, and even in some circumstances, not some circumstances, most definitely in China, it's a very similar situation. There hasn't been a peaceful protest in China since Tiananmen Square, and not many people actually know what that is in China because the government has put such heavy censorship. And it's overwhelmed me, and saying this question is overwhelming too. What are your thoughts?
Wow, okay. First of all, it's a pleasure to even speak to a young activist
Who lives in China. That's wonderful. Okay. So China is a really good and important example because the government there spends an unprecedented amount on domestic stabilization. Basically, there's been these studies that, in China, it's okay to critique the government or policies, but as soon as you call for a protest, then it's like censored across the board. And so the one challenge is this idea of these protests being censored. And then the second thing is about Assad. So let's take the first thing. I think it's really important to realize, though, that when protest is made difficult, it just makes it more inevitable. You can never fully stop protest. In fact, by delaying it, you just make it more powerful. And so, and this you can see in the example, I think, of the Russian Revolution. A lot of times activists today, it's like we're kind of like, we like to like almost whine about how difficult it is. But if you go back to like the Russian Revolution, I mean, the Tsar had secret police all over Europe. It was just as difficult. They were under just as much surveillance relative to the technological levels that they had, and just as much difficulty. I mean, the Bolsheviks didn't have enough money to print their newspaper. They were like arrested wherever they went. They went sent to concentration camps in Canada, Trotsky was, and stuff like that. So all activists everywhere have always faced repression, and that repression has always been severe, and it's always been at the capacity of the government. The government's always used its full capacities to repress movements that might want to oust the government. It's just a fact of doing social change. So I think that protesters in China, it's just beholden to them to develop new techniques to get around. If they can't use social media, then don't use social media. I think that in the end, it's kind of a supreme confidence. I think one of the things that they had in the Russian Revolution is because of Marxism is a kind of sense of the inevitable victory of their movement, and that kind of motivated them forward through all sorts of adversity, whereas I think today a lot of activists get discouraged too easily. So I think that the first answer is just basically, yeah, I know it's hard, obviously, but, so what, just keep going. The second thing, though, is about this question of Assad, and this really gets, I think, at the seriousness of what we're talking about, which is that, sometimes these situations, they turn into like civil war situations where it's actually like an armed conflict. And then how are you going to protest in a place where there's people shooting guns and stuff like that? And I think you're absolutely right. And that's one of the travesties of, and that's another example, someone asked about people being used. I think that's another example of how people were used to a certain extent in Syria to try to destabilize Assad, and then it turned into a civil war type situation that was horrible. And so, again, it's like social movements, you're playing with fire. And I think as much as possible, you have to avoid violence and avoid going into a civil war situation, because it seems that once you enter into a civil war like that, you basically have lost, so it is a real tragedy. It's another way that the movement can fail is by devolving into kind of a civil war. So I hope that helps think about at least some of what you're... Thank you.
My question is, there's a lot of strength of activism when it comes to institutional racism, when it comes to discrimination or repression, or any sort of thing that affects the individual very directly. But when it comes to issues like climate change that are very slow and indirect, you don't see the same amount of motivation and activism to that degree. So do you think we'll ever see a large degree of activism when it comes to issues like global warming? Or will it be too late at that point when the effects have already been faced?
Okay, so on the one hand, and I'm gonna give you guys some horrible news, it might already be too late,
and so the climate catastrophe may have already happened, it might already be behind us, and we might already be living in the post-climate catastrophe, and this is just what it looks like and what it feels like to be in that moment. So that's the first thing, is that I suspect it's probably already happened. Now, if it's already happened, then I think it changes our perspective on what constitutes victory for a social movement around something that's already happened. But I think that so that would be my first answer. But the second thing is, I think the question of why climate change, why mass movements around climate change haven't seemed to materialize in the way that we've hoped. And I think that the fundamental answer there is that climate change activism has been too oriented around rationalism and science. Like if you think about 350.org, it's about this number that only a machine can test. No one can feel or test 350 parts per billion of carbon dioxide. It's a rational scientific thing, not an emotional thing. And like I said, social movements are created from a contagious mood and a new tactic. And it's not actually about rational people, it's actually about this mood, how it feels to join the movement. That's why people join the movement, because it was to go to an Occupy event, you felt like you were a wonderful person and everyone there was a wonderful person and we were all beautiful. That's literally how it felt, And so that would be my answer, is that if you want to create a movement around climate change and climate justice, then it has to be at the level of, well, what's the mood of this movement? What does it feel like to be part of this movement? And what is the new tactic? What's the innovation that gets people to believe that they're going to win? So this is another core concept, is that people don't go with the movement that they think is the biggest or the strongest. They join the movement they think is going to win. That's the key insight. So you have to create a force that people believe is going to win. And then people join because they think, oh, yes, finally, this is it. So thank you for your question.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth from Bali Island School.
Wonderful, thank you for...
And like you said, I'm scared as hell, so I hope this is a good idea.
Okay.
My question is about protests against the actions of the government and or the government itself. Have you considered the possibility that protests may fail solely because the governments realize that there's nothing to lose by saying no? There's nothing to lose, and they are given the option to refuse the argument created by the public, and to them it is a better option, so why would they let the protests change anything? Following this theory, if governments had more to lose by objecting to the movement, would that make the movement more successful?
Okay, excellent question. I think you're getting at the core problem with protests today.
So we don't even have to look at Indonesia or China. We can look right at America, the place that people claim to be the height of democracy, okay? There is no reason in America for an elected representative to listen to a protest. It's not required by the Constitution. It's not required by any sort of law. There's no law that says that, hey, you know, if people start protesting in the streets, you better listen, otherwise something bad's going to happen. No, it's not true at all. And we've for years have been acting as if there is some sort of reason. If I can get, 10,000 people to march, then the people in power have to listen. No, there's no reason. So what's happened is that, and I think you can trace this back, if you want to do that kind of a historical analysis, you can trace this back to 2003 when we had a global anti-war march, and there was marches in every country, probably Indonesia as well had one, against the Iraq war. And millions of people all over the world protested against the war, and it didn't stop the governments from going ahead with the war. So the key insight to realize as a young person is that there is no requirement for governments to listen to protest. Okay, so that's the primary problem that we're up against. Protest has become something that is expected. It's just something that's part of the process of doing politics. Politicians know that there's going to be protests, so that when the protests happen, it doesn't matter. But as to your second question, this idea that, well, if they had something to lose, I'm also a little bit skeptical of that interpretation. I think for me, it's more of a question of thinking, well, how do the protesters become the ones in power? How do we reorient back to the fundamental problem, which is we have something that we want, and how do we get it? So for example, in Bali, you have this land reclamation movement. Stop the reclamation, or stop the takeover of this land. Well, how do you get to be in a position where you can be the force who stops it? Because you're the ones who are in control of the decision. That, I think, is the fundamental question. It's a question of sovereignty, basically. And so I think you're right on to observe that people in power don't need to listen to protests. And I think that the next step then is to think, well, how do we become the ones in power?
Thank you.
Thank you.